Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us for Dreaming of Circular Futures, a Maintainers Movement Fellowship event led by our amazing fellow Jenna Jones. As I said, I'm the Community Outreach and Events Coordinator for the Maintainers. And the Maintainers is a global research network interested in the concepts of maintenance, infrastructure, repair, and the myriad forms of labor and expertise that are necessary to sustain our human-built world. One of the variety of things that we do here at the Maintainers is host a Maintainers Movement Fellowship, which advances the movement for maintenance thinking and action by bridging together individuals who are interested in these concepts and putting it together to the work that they're doing out in the field. And so the fellows really partner with the Maintainers to advance this vision for a more caring and well-maintained world through their own research, which you'll hear a little bit about today. And so today, our event lead is Jenna Jones in the Localities Pathway. This year, we're so grateful to Jenna sharing your expertise. Jenna has shared so many wonderful stories with us about how the circular economy kind of expands and is many different aspects of life, which I think is something that we think about and talk about a lot at the Maintainers. And so we're so grateful to you, Jenna, for sharing your thoughts and knowledge with us. And so just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. This event, as you can see, is going to be recorded for our collective reference. We do this with all of our events. And the event recording will be sent out to the attendees at the end actually like in about a week or so, along with notes and references gathered during the event. And to learn more about the Maintainers, you are invited to check out our website. And I'd like to specifically point you in the direction of our code of engagement. And so I will go over the code of engagement that pertains specifically to our virtual events. And I'll also copy and paste that into our chat. So if you'd like to read along, here it is. And so, yeah, our code of engagement kind of is a code or method of practice that we like to utilize at the Maintainers. And so we understand that events will work best when all parties intentionally include a range of lived experiences and identities, act in a respectful manner, and demonstrate courtesy and grace in words and actions, when we prioritize accessibility, when we, on the Maintainers end, clarify expectations for speakers and attendees regarding ways to contribute to the conversation, when to mute and unmute, how questions will be received, prioritized, and types of harmful behaviors that will not be permitted in the virtual events or physical spaces that we host, as well as the accountability measures in place to monitor for those behaviors. So in regards to this event, how we're going to do questions and answers is that you're going to message them to me specifically, in the private chat. You'll send them to me, Q&A, Liliana, the Maintainers. Or you will do the raise hand function and you will be called upon by Jenna to speak. So other than that, we're not doing group chat questions, just so that we can kind of keep the conversation moving forward. Additionally, we'll all be on mute except for the speakers at the given time. And so the last little point of the code of engagement is that we do not tolerate harassment of conference participants in any form. Our events are dedicated to providing a harassment-free experience for everyone, regardless of gender, gender identity and expression, age, sexual orientation, disability, physical appearance, body size, race, ethnicity, religion or lack thereof, or technology choices. And so if this is not possible, we will be kindly removing you from the event. And this is just something that we like to go over to make sure that we're creating an inclusive and supportive space to all of our speakers and to all of our guests. Again, so we're so grateful to have you here. The Maintainers is just so grateful. And so if you would like to keep introducing yourselves in the chat, please feel free to put your name, pronouns, and where you're calling in from. And I'm going to pass it over to you, Jenna. Thank you so much.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Liliana. Let me share my screen really quickly. Let's see. Okay. Can you all see my screen? I see you nodding. Perfect. Yes, just to give some background, as Liliana kind of very beautifully said, my name is Jenna Jones. I use she, her pronouns. And I am currently the Maintaining Localities Fellow of the Maintainers Movement. And I also am a third-year MArch student at Columbia GSAP. So I study architecture at the Columbia School of the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation. And also I am a waste consultant at the Center for Zero Waste Design, which is a nonprofit organization in Brooklyn that focuses on like waste management at the city scale. And as Liliana pointed out, this panel really is meant to kind of expand the definition of the circular economy. I feel like it's definitely a buzzword, and we'll get into that. But I really wanted to at least focus on what these four amazing women have been doing in their fields, as their work ranges from remanufacturing to reuse to discard studies to city planning, and really focusing on how expansive the circular economy is, but also the risks that you that kind of come with sort of a broadened, very kind of like diffuse view of the circular economy. So just to start off, it's always good to start off with the definition, naturally. The Ellen MacArthur Foundation defines the circular economy as a regenerative system in which resource input and waste emission and energy leakage are minimized by slowing, closing, and narrowing material and energy loops, thanks to long-lasting design, maintenance, repair, reuse, remanufacturing, refurbishing, and recycling. And there's definitely a hierarchy, right, with these sorts of things. But at least with the circular economy, when you think about it, you often see this graphic, right? You see kind of permutations of this graphic where there's this giant circle that shows kind of how we could live in a perfect world where remanufacturing goes, directly into consumption, which goes directly into recycling and reuse, and everything's great. But the only issue with that is that the circular economy, at least how it's been popularized and kind of discussed in kind of corporate circles or even policy circles that are like well-meaning, is that it sort of kind of leaves out a lot of information. And some of the information that I've included, which is again not exhaustive at all, but just thinking about labor in the circular economy, you think about how recycling centers still, employ people to kind of do very, very remedial labor. You think about, are there opportunities for, kind of advancing in certain jobs, how our construction workers unionized, our architects unionized, our designers unionized, where are the opportunities for growth? But also outside of just labor, other considerations about how far distances materials need to travel, how closed are these loops, right? How local are these loops? If we were to adopt something with more reduced consumerism, what does GDP look like in that situation when it's so focused on us buying and buying and buying in kind of our free market world? And also because landfills are sort of built on sort of material accumulation and they're profited by the size and kind of like by weight. How do we rethink landfills in this kind of new arena? And so basically I wanted to kind of focus on all these different considerations and these critiques of the circular economy to prevent it from turning into words that we often use in other contexts. So for example, we've all familiar with these words, possibly, maybe not, but the green transition, right? The Anthropocene, decolonization, again, all important words that have been used to advance very, very kind of alternative modes of being in a world that has a linear economy, right? However, there still are kind of, because these words aren't specific enough, we tend to kind of lose their meaning or lose their specificity. So these are some really, really great articles that I recommend people reading if they're interested in learning more about this. But essentially, David Pello is a really phenomenal critical environmental justice scholar. I think him and Robert Bullard coined the term, environmental justice, but David Pello helps so nuance into environmental justice, is focusing on critical environmental justice that focuses more so on all the faults that the recycling industry has. We see the world as kind of like extractive versus non-extractive, but there's still so much nuance in that when you think about labor and environmental justice. Anthropocene is also a very common term to describe just kind of the human age, right? When when kind of our contributions to the environment have led to, greenhouse gas emissions and things like that. However, when you kind of use the word anthro, like a human, you're sort of kind of choosing a term that is meant to include all humans, but really people from Western countries are the ones most contributing to these sort of like climatic changes. So would you rather use Capitalocene or Plantationocene and instead of Anthropocene? And then lastly, decolonization is another example. That's a word that's been kind of popularized as well, but oftentimes we talk about decolonizing our pedagogy or decolonizing our corporate structures, and the word is used so varyingly with that, the initial definition of literally trying to break away from colonial structures is getting diffused and watered down. This panel simply attempts to expand the definition of circular economy and break it away from its very, very utopian, as of now, connotation. And so I have 4 very lovely speakers that I'm very excited to introduce. We have Samantha McBride, Jackie Kurak-Fram, and Shaura Jimenez and Fatou Dey, all of which have focused, or at least touched either very directly or on the periphery, this concept of circular economy in vastly different fields. And so you'll pretty much be getting a taste of everything. You'll be getting a taste of technology innovations in the circular economy, reuse, discard studies, city management. And I'm just really excited to kind of have everyone here, and then we'll all join for a larger Q&A at the end. But first, I wanted to do a really quick audience calibration to make sure that we're all familiar, or at least so we know how familiar you are with certain terms. So I'm not asking you to answer any of these questions, but I want you to simply raise your hand or react in the chat, or react, here like this. So I have 3 questions for you all. And again, no answers needed, just reactions. Who here is familiar with the term cradle to grave? Okay, yay, that's great. Who here is familiar, if I had to like unmute you and ask you to provide a definition for biogas, would you be able to do it? Okay, there's less people, but still people are doing it, yay. And then lastly, who here knows what MSW means in the context of waste management? Okay, less people still, but it's a funny reaction, Tiana. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. And just to introduce our first speaker, let me pull up my notes really quickly. Our first speaker will be Samantha McBride. Samantha McBride teaches urban environmentalism and public management at the Marx School of International and Public Affairs at Baruch College, CUNY, and is a professional in public works management of garbage and sewage. She has a doctorate in sociology from NYU and studied biology as an undergraduate at Johns Hopkins. Samantha's interests center on discards measurement and characterization methods, biological material flows, plastics pollution, composting and land access, corporate hegemony, and waste colonialism. Samantha has also recently begun research on the contemporary UFO phenomenon in the Western Hemisphere and its relation to questions of technology, religion, knowledge, and ecology. So take it away, Samantha. You're still on mute, by the way. Oh, you're still on mute.
Okay. Can everybody see the screen? My screen? Okay, wonderful. So, hi and thank you. I'm Samantha McBride. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm glad to be here to talk about reuse in the context of municipal solid waste. And I'm going to comment on several portions of New York City trash that you see pictured here that may lend themselves to reuse, namely textiles, furniture, toys, and appliances. But to start, I'd like to speak somewhat more abstractly about reuse using the abstract schematics of the circular economy. What you see here should be familiar. It's a schematic showing how goods that are sourced from extraction, that are manufactured and marketed, end up as something that somebody buys and, unfortunately, in today's world, usually move on to discard and waste. Reuse interrupts this flow by routing the good back into use, making it available, ideally many times over, instead of landfilling or incineration. And it's often said, not just about reuse, but also recycling, that this is expected to contribute to less extraction, to decreased production, and to save things like natural resources, ecosystems, and energy, etc. This is a very common assumption that is said, as I mentioned, not only about reuse, but also recycling. Now, there's no reason theoretically or abstractly why reuse or recycling couldn't achieve such reductions if you get the scale and the coordination large enough. But most of the time, the reductions don't happen. And this is because if reduced demand for new products reaches a scale that producers notice, there are many other directions that they can go in besides scaling back production. They can seek new markets. This is really the major response. They can lower prices, or they can make buying even more convenient. They can emphasize hygiene concerns about used goods. For example, this was tried in the case of canvas reusable shopping bags. And of course, there are the well-known tactics of planned obsolescence, with almost diabolical efforts to make repair for reuse impossible. The graph you see here is a conceptual one. It shows trends that are common across many industries where you have virgin extraction and production growing along with and not diminished by reuse and recycling taking place. Now, of course, each inquiry about the degree of reuse or recycling substitution for raw material needs to be specific to those materials, geographies, industries, and time periods. And often that is very difficult because the data needed to analyze these trends is proprietary to producers and not shared, and also because production is globalized. But it's just not the case that the sum of recycling or reuse that has taken place, let's say, since 1970, has in the main saved the planet. And it hasn't saved people living around mines or in the way of pipelines or in polluted communities, to name a few violences of extractive production. This doesn't mean, however, that reuse is a pointless endeavor. Quite the contrary. But I believe that it's important to make the goals and scope of reuse programs clear. Instituting reuse programs in cities and towns gets needed goods to people, and that in and of itself is the right thing to do. Reuse builds community enterprise and can help decouple consumption from the growth imperative of large production systems. And it's political because reuse, if done in certain ways, can move away from relying on commodification, which means selling things to make a profit, for absolutely everything needed to sustain people's lives. This can be important, especially as current and coming effects of climate change leave communities cut off from global supply chains in moments of extreme loss. There are already vibrant, decentralized reuse economies for high-end furniture, but not most furniture. There is a massive global and domestic trade in used clothing, some moving through nonprofits like Goodwill, which I've worked with a lot, that have centuries-long ties to community building. But there's still substantial portions of these items that are going to the trash, as shown in these statistics for New York City. As you see, almost 8% of the trash going to landfills or incinerators at last measurement was textiles. Over 2% was furniture, with lower quantities of toys and appliances in the mix. When asking ourselves why such perfectly good stuff is still going into the trash, it's important to look at the specific economies of each item. For wood furniture, you have massively increased supply of low quality, hard to repair items and crashing demand for used furniture among consumers. For toys, you have the issue not only of hygiene, but also stigma. I think we'd all agree that no kid should get a soiled or battered toy, and the material makeup of toys today means that they break and break down quickly. For household appliances like toasters, etc., you also have declining quality. Today's irons, in contrast to this picture that I took in 2004, are not metal, and they're amazingly cheap. The flowchart here extends the simplified one I showed earlier. For reuse, if someone directly sells or gives away an unwanted item, or if they pick it at the curb, as with Mungo, which is what it's called, at least in New York City, it goes right back into use. But in most cases, what is happening with reuse are staged processes of consolidation, sorting, and movement before reintroduction into the economy. And this general requirement also holds for recycling. There are many steps involving labor, truck transport, storage, and handling that take place before a reused or recycled item can be commoditized, or in some cases, even given away. Each costs money and requires space. And the reasonable question is, what can governments do to facilitate these flows? I would argue that enlisting waste management operations, such as sanitation departments, for this process is not needed and counterproductive. What governments can do instead is provide land, space, and if necessary, permitting support to small enterprises, and can ensure that the labor involved is fair wage and leads to job development. At federal scales, they can regulate producer behavior around planned obsolescence and right to repair. And to return to the why of reuse of this way of working with discards, I'd like to suggest that reuse tonnages should not be the object of inclusion in citywide, calculating citywide diversion rates, although there's certainly no harm in it. A lot of advocacy in New York City over the last 20 years has been focused on promoting reuse to the point that it is going to actually register in the city's diversion rate. As I've mentioned, reuse is part of political movements of folks who realize that the global system of commoditized production and waste is not serving them. And that's pretty different than focusing on a diversion rating increase. And I'd be glad to discuss this in more depth later in the panel. Thank you.
Right, thank you so much, Samantha. We're going to next have Jackie Kerouac-Fram. So Jackie has more than 15 years of experience helping nonprofits thrive through stakeholder engagement, strategic collaboration, and striving towards justice through equity and inclusion. Since March 2019, she has served as executive director at the Rebuilding Center in Portland, Oregon. It's a climate justice nonprofit that harnesses the power of reuse and repair of reclaimed building materials to reduce consumption and production of new materials and to support home retention for low-income homeowners. Prior to this position, she was vice president at Focus St. Louis, a nonprofit civic leadership organization where she led efforts to increase community support and engagement around policy issues that impact the health and well-being of communities. Jackie has a PhD in American Studies from St. Louis University, where she published at the intersection of urban policy and racial equity, specifically concerned with racialized aspects of public transportation, policy, and funding. Her work has been published in the Journal of Urban History, Souls, a critical journal of Black politics, culture and society, and Radical History Review. And she is a proud recipient of the Andrew W. Mellon ACLS Dissertation Completion Fellowship. She has spent her entire career in the nonprofit sector and believes in the power of communities to drive policy change towards justice. Take it away, Jackie. You're on mute still. Jackie, you're on, oh yeah, okay.
Okay, if you screen share before you unmute yourself, you can't find your unmute button. Okay, here we go. Good morning, everybody. Afternoon for those of you on the East Coast. My name is Jackie Kerouac-Fram. I'm the executive director of the Rebuilding Center, as Jenna mentioned. I'm really happy to be here today, and I think my talk is a wonderful pairing with Samantha's, because as you'll hear, we are a reuse and repair organization. And our journey has been one that has really shifted us from thinking about reuse as a materials management strategy, exclusively thinking about things like diversion rates into an organization that really thinks hard about how we can leverage all those materials to create strong community resilience. So, okay. So the Rebuilding Center is a climate justice organization. Our mission is to build community resilience by making reuse and repair accessible and affordable for all. The reason that we exist is in part because there are, at latest estimate, around 458 million tons of construction debris thrown into the landfill each year. And a lot of that material is still quite usable, especially things like lumber and doors and windows, appliances. And one of the main reasons that people lose their homes, pair that information about the amount of material that's disposed of with the fact that one of the main reasons that people lose their homes is an inability to perform or afford basic repairs. So I'll talk a little bit about what we do, and then I'll get more into some information about why it's so important. So currently we practice reuse through our store. And you can see there that when we think about the purpose of our store, it's really around economic resilience and waste reduction. So we sell reclaimed building materials at deeply discounted prices. Typically, we carry just about every item category that you would find at a big box store, but we sell it for less than 50% of retail price, trying to make it accessible and affordable for everyone. And so we price our materials just at the threshold that would allow us to maintain our space, our physical space, and pay our team thriving wages. In doing so, we keep more than 2 million pounds of stuff out of the landfill each year and circulate it back into the community rather, as a resource for home improvements, for creative reuse. I mean, people use our stuff all sorts of ways, but the way we like to think about it is that we are trying to support affordable and accessible home repair. Along with that, we do offer repair education, which we see repair very strongly as a form of empowerment to help folks create a strong sense of sovereignty in their own homes. We build participants' knowledge and confidence in home repair skills so that they can do home repairs, or at least know when to call a professional. And when and if they call a professional, they know enough about their home systems that they can be an active participant and not be taken advantage of. So we offer 160 classes a year or more in our carpentry, electrical, plumbing, repair, wall framing tools, all manner of different types of home repair classes. And they are pretty affordable for our community. And we also offer scholarships to make sure that folks who can't afford the tuition have opportunity to participate. So back in 2021, emerging from the height of COVID, we took a pause and asked ourselves some of the key questions that Samantha addressed in her presentation. So is it enough to keep material out of the landfill? Is it enough? You know, the majority of our items are dry waste. They take up space in a landfill, but they don't leach. They're not usually being incinerated, right? So what is the benefit of keeping these materials out of the landfill? And is that a sufficient mission activity to drive all of our work here? Also, where do our materials come from? What are we doing with them? Who were we aiming to serve with them? And what impact did we want to create? So we really started to think hard about, if we're moving beyond just keeping stuff out of the landfill, which was really the mantra for the organization for many years, what is it that we're trying to do here? And the main driving question that we wrangled with was where our materials come from. So as some of you may know, Portland, Oregon is a city with a fairly significant housing crisis. Our housing prices are extremely high. And there has been a tremendous amount of rapid gentrification. Rebuilding Center, our organization, our facility is located in a historically Black neighborhood. There has been a ton of displacement throughout the city, and anyone, you know, with low or moderate incomes have been displaced to the literal margins of the city. So when we stopped and asked, where does our material come from? The answer is the vast majority of it comes from deconstruction efforts and renovation efforts that are taking place in the context of this gentrification, people are buying homes and tearing them down. People are buying homes and renovating them, and the people that they're buying them from are being displaced out to the outer edges. That did not sit comfortably for us. So we decided that as an intervention in that system, one of the things that we could do is focus our work on home repair as an affordable housing tool. So I'm going to quickly go through some really fascinating information here, fascinating for us. So for every affordable housing unit that we build, and this is national organization data, not just for Portland, 2 others are lost to abandonment, deterioration, or conversion to more expensive housing. It also costs an average of 26 times more to build a new affordable home than to repair an existing one. 45% of homes built before 1940, I can't even see my own screen, 1946 are in need of repair, and 33% of all occupied homes have structural, plumbing, electrical problems. They have leaks, they have poor air circulation, they have dampness, they have mold. And most substandard homes described in that 33% are occupied by people who need physical or financial assistance with repairs. They are elderly, or they don't have the financial resources to be able to hire out the help. And that has been especially exacerbated since the cost of some lumber products has increased. These are figures from 2021. They've come down a bit, but the cost of building materials is still far higher than it used to be. In addition, the CDC has identified investing in home repairs for low-income households as a high-impact strategy for addressing the root causes of poor health due to dampness and mold and inadequate temperature control. And they've demonstrated that for every dollar spent on urgent home repairs, it can save $19 in Medicare and Medicaid costs. So this is a real strategy that is not being activated. Most importantly, home repair improves physical and mental health for occupants. It keeps the homes from falling into significant disrepair and abandonment or purchase by predatory purchasers. So, once a piece of affordable housing stock is sold or lost to a purchaser who's going to renovate it, flip it, typically that piece of affordable housing stock is gone forever. It will never be affordable again. So home repair, if it's done well, instead of selling to the highest bidder because someone has lost their home due to an inability to do the repairs, helps property values increase more sustainably, which benefits the whole neighborhood. In response to all that thinking and research, we developed, and we're launching this month, I'm really excited about it, a new program called Home Repair for All, which really blends our emphasis on empowerment and economic resilience through reuse and repair. So through this program, which we're starting with a pilot cohort this month, but going into the future, it will be 2 cohorts of 30 participants per year, will receive free home repair classes and free materials. And so in addition to money saved environment for first-time homeowners to get to know each other, oftentimes these folks are first-time homeowners in their family. There's no generational home ownership. They might not know other homeowners in their friend circles. And so we're also aiming through this program to connect them to one another as they learn practical repair skills and strengthen their own confidence in their home ownership. And I share all of this because for me, it is a strong illustration that market-based reuse is not the only answer. There's so much emphasis in the reuse space on how to take materials that already exist, turn them into something else, how to commodify reuse for profit. And I would argue that resource reallocation, not down or upcycling or commodification, carries the least cost and greatest potential to increase resilience and well-being. The market writ large tends to make reuse less accessible and reduce community benefit for the sake of profit. So quickly, one case study that I wanted to share is market-based deconstruction in Portland, Oregon. So some of you may know that in 2016, our city passed a deconstruction ordinance. Rebuilding Center was at the table. It was an exciting moment at the time. Rebuilding Center was a pioneer in the deconstruction sector. We had been doing it at that point for almost 20 years. And there was only one other entity in the city that was doing that service, and they were a for-profit company. The deconstruction ordinance defines which structures are to be deconstructed. It at one point at its launch provided training for deconstruction contractors, provided initial incentives, and had no salvage requirement. So the idea was, here are these buildings, they have a lot of salvage potential. You must deconstruct them, which is the process of taking a building apart by hand. You may not any longer mechanically demolish them, tear them into bits, and throw them into the landfill. In the first 3 years of the ordinance, there was an explosion in for-profit deconstruction contractors. So where there were 2 in 2016, by 2019, there were 13. Bid prices fell through the floor. A lot of the contractors were using casual labor without thriving wages. And because there was not ever a minimum requirement for salvage, by 2022, there was only a 2.6% average salvage rate. So the weight of a house, the city's data reflects that only 2.6% is being salvaged, which sounds ridiculously small. The industry standard is only 3.6%, which also feels small, but is what's realistic. And even still, our average is far below that, with 42% of deconstructions in 2022 salvaging less than 2% even. And there are now no nonprofit deconstruction contractors in the market. We stepped out ourselves in 2019 because we could no longer afford to pay a team at the bid rates that were happening. So I would encourage anyone who's thinking about reuse to never write off the benefits of community-based reuse. It supports local economies and small businesses. It meets local needs. It builds local community resilience and resources without a profit mandate. It builds self-sufficiency amongst community members and supports economic justice through financial accessibility. And finally, I'll just leave you with these thoughts. So community-based reuse initiatives prioritize community benefit because it's not enough to keep things out of the landfill. We need to use reclaimed resources to support thriving communities. And I didn't put this in part of this presentation, but I have another presentation next week that I'm giving that is all about the importance of public funding for this work. It is mandatory for reuse, especially in this current economic climate, to continue to be able to support communities and provide community benefit. We need public support. And that's all. Thank you so much. I'll look forward to your questions after.
Thank you so much, Jackie. That was amazing, especially the last couple of slides that where you kind of dug a little deeper into the numbers. Really excited to talk about that and some other kind of questions that were raised during the presentation. Now I would like to divert our attention to Anne Shower Jimenez. Let me pull up her bio really quickly. So Dr. Anne Shower Jimenez is the Chief Operations Officer and co-founder of Mango Materials, a San Francisco Bay Area-based scale-up company that manufactures a bio-based and biodegradable polymer, and manages the products team, which is focused on PHA formulations for injection molded goods, biopolyester fibers, 3D printing for additive manufacturing, and thin films and sheets, and fosters relationships with brands and their supply chain partners who are looking for sustainable cosmetic and food packaging, along with rigid products and biodegradable biopolyesters for the fashion textile industry. Take it away, Anne.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen. And there we go. Can you see my screen? Everything good? Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Jenna, for having me here today. I'm going to switch gears just slightly and talk about my company and our kind of dreaming of a PHA future. So we're seeing two big environmental problems right now. The first is actually on the right. It's that of plastics pollution. There's plastics everywhere. And the second on the left is that of climate change. So at Mango Materials, we exist. We founded ourselves to replace the polluting plastics with biodegradable materials. And here's how we do it. So we actually are co-located at the site of methane production. So we're at a wastewater treatment plant right now, and I'll show some pictures later. But we basically capture these methane emissions and feed them to a specialized set of bacteria. These bacteria will eat the carbon from the methane and grow a polymer inside of their cell walls. So we do have to break open their cells, and what comes out of our facility is a powder. We then pelletize it and actually formulate it in order so that it's processable on traditional supply chain equipment. So these pellets end up being converted into biodegradable products. And then our goal and dream, kind of going along with the theme, is for them to be used as long as possible. But there is some items that are meant for a shorter term use, and they will end up back at a waste facility. If this waste facility is a wastewater treatment plant or a landfill, which has an anaerobic environment, methane is actually produced. So we can close the loop and create this cradle to cradle cycle around plastics. Now, a little bit more about the polymer that we make. It's in the family of polyhydroxyalkanoate. I don't expect everyone to memorize or be able to rattle that one off. It's quite a mouthful. And actually at Mango Materials, we produce one type, and it's called poly-3-hydroxybutyrate, P3HB. And why do we use methane? Why is that important? Well, we really feel that it's widely available. People don't realize how much methane is around them. I actually was speaking to a graduate group yesterday, and they were like, well, aren't you afraid that you're competing with methane? And I'm like, oh, there is plenty to go around, unfortunately, but fortunate for us. It brings about a positive environmental impact and allows for a superior life cycle assessment, because you're actually capturing and sequestering this greenhouse gas into a product. So that's all about the feedstock of our material. When it comes to end of life, PHA has a very unique profile. Unlike other traditional plastics for sure, and even some other bioplastics that you hear about, PHA is actually biodegradable in many different environments. So it could be your home compost, your garden, a landfill, a wastewater treatment plant, or even in the aquatic environments. And we have some really great, exciting work going on with UC Santa Barbara, where we're actually deploying objects made out of our material in the Santa Barbara Channel, in the Atlantic Ocean. So you're actually seeing how it biodegrades in the actual ocean, whereas some of the other studies are jar studies on a desk or on a table, in a lab. We're actually looking at it in the field environment. So we really feel like we should be designing for the naturally occurring carbon cycle. We want to keep carbon in play. Here's just some quick biodegradation work that we did previously. So this is not the Santa Barbara work. We will be able to share that in another year or so. It's quite a long study. But what you'll see here is actually on the left, we have fibers. So those are thin fibers that are actually knitted or woven to make clothing. So it's the fiber. And on the top, you have the PHA fibers. The middle is organic cotton, and the bottom is traditional polyester. Now, we happen to have a friend who has a boat in the Berkeley Marina, and we asked him nicely if we could dangle these PVC pipes off of his boat to see what happens. And what we found that after 6 weeks, the PHA fiber and the organic cotton are no longer there, while the polyester fiber is this dark kind of brown wrap that you see here on the bottom. So it's still hanging on. We followed that up with doing what we call respirometry testing. So this is actually in a jar. So this is not in the field environment. But what you'll see here is an increase in carbon dioxide when it comes to PHA, our material here. And you actually want that. It sounds not what you want, but the more carbon dioxide you have, that means the microorganisms that are doing the biodegradation are respiring. They're breathing just like us. And the more that they release the carbon dioxide, the more the material is being biodegraded. But the next slide is probably my favorite one here. And this is an SEM image of these same fibers. They're the fibers that you saw on the left-hand side of the previous photo, but this is in a soil environment. So again, I'm just trying to demonstrate that there's many different environments that this can occur in. And on the left again is day 0, and you have the PHA fiber on the top, the organic cotton in the middle, and the PET on the bottom. And then on the right, it's after 55 days in 60 degrees C in a soil environment. And 93% of this PHA fiber is no longer there. About 50% of the organic cotton, which is great. And then you look at the PET on the bottom, and it's basically indistinguishable from day 0 to day 55, meaning that there was no biodegradation that occurred. So the interesting thing about all these environments is that there's a set of microorganisms that will do this biodegradation. These materials will not biodegrade spontaneously when you're using it. They're durable, they can be washed, dishwasher, washing machine, etc. But once you enter a microbial rich environment like the soil or the ocean or your garden, that's when the biodegradation occurs. So we are offering 2 solutions. The first is, and it's really based on feedstock. The first is our plant-based PHA. So we can use plant sugars to make the same material. It is a good story. It has a low carbon footprint. But when you look at our methane-based technology, that is corn, bread, and butter, 2 mango materials. This is where you get, as we say, more bang for our buck when it comes to the environment, because it's made from a waste greenhouse gas, and it can be carbon negative. So that's where you start to really, especially the brands that we're talking to, they really are looking for that carbon intensity, and our YAP Plus is really where we're trending towards. And I'll tell you a little bit later about how we're scaling that technology. But in the meantime, we do have some articles that are out in the market now. So most of them are for hard goods, so injection molded objects. We're seeing a lot of interest from the beauty space. So we have a soap dish from the beauty brand Natura that's here on the upper right that is sold in a store in Brazil. And it's basically to hold bar soap or bar shampoos. And here's just a spattering of various other objects that we have molded with partners over the course of the year. The other thing that will be added next spring is we are part of Allbirds, the shoe company, their net zero shoe. So we have molded the emblem, and we are working towards eventually having a full PHA shoe in the future. But for this launch, we will be a small portion of a great project that has a great mission behind it. But we're also working on our work in fibers. To be able to replace polyester is key. It's a huge undertaking, but also thin films. Thin films generally don't get recycled. And that's a really interesting thing that we're thinking about when we look at the markets is the objects that fall through the recycling stream that end up in the landfill already is a prime opportunity for something like PHA. So here's a picture of a knitted swatch using our materials. But we also have some work going on with 3D printing. It's kind of a hot thing right now, and we've actually had 2 grants that allowed us to pursue this. The first is part of a NASA grant. They want to not have to bring up all the materials that they need when they go into space for longer missions to Mars, etc. So they want to be able to 3D print materials on demand, but allow us to also, not pollute on other planets like we have already started with Earth. But also more recently, the same UC Santa Barbara grant with UC Santa Barbara that we have really looks at ocean deployment objects, buoys, sensors, the like that do tend to get lost in the ocean. Can we 3D print those on demand? And then if they do get lost and not recovered, they are fully biodegradable and not harmful to those ecosystems. So here's a few photos of some objects that we've worked on with 3D printing. So when it comes to scaling, that's been a really key focus for us. We don't want to be a small polymer in a big environment here. We want to be the next Dow and DuPont for PHA someday, but it takes a while to get there. So far we have completed everything through this launch facility. That's the 4th picture here. We are currently operational at a wastewater treatment plant in Northern California. It's in a city called Vacaville, California. And that's where we take their methane gas, their biogas, and we produce the PHA powder on site. We are actually using that facility and the methane there for the design and construction of our first full-scale commercial plant, this flagship plant that's far on the right. So we're in the design and construction phase of that now, hoping for it to be online in the next year or so. So here's a few photos of our current launch facility. And this is our team during the height of COVID, when we were essential because we were at a wastewater treatment plant, but of course needed to be very protected. So we are excited about this facility. It's huge compared to our last one, but we know that our full scale plant, in order to start to make a dent into the plastics industry, needs to be 10 to 20 times bigger than this one. And then finally, from myself and my two co-founders, Molly and Allison, we have this big dream, this big vision to really change the way that people think, feel, use plastics. It's a long journey, but we're very excited to be a part of it and excited to answer any questions that you have. So thank you.
Thank you, Anne. That was amazing. We already have some questions in the Q&A that are really fascinating, and I'm really excited to go into them. We actually have one more presentation by my professor, Fatou Dey. Let me quickly show her, do her introduction real quick. Let's see. So Fatou Dey is a consultant specialized in the design of buildings, policy frameworks, and the corresponding supply chain mechanics necessary for building sub-Saharan Africa's next generation of green and inclusive cities. She was previously the managing director of SCAT Consulting's offices in Rwanda, Burundi, and DRC Congo, responsible for the implementation of the Swiss Corporation's Construction Industry Transformation Program for Africa's Great Lakes region. Prior to joining SCAT, Fatou was team leader for the Affordable Housing and Neighborhood Development Unit for the city of Kigali and an urban designer for the New York City Department of City Planning. Fatou holds degrees in architecture, urban planning, and sustainability management from Princeton and Columbia Universities, and a certificate in international housing finance systems from the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School. So take it away, Fatou.
Unmute. That might be helpful. So good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Jenna, and the entire team for allowing me to participate with these powerhouse women who are doing great work. So what I'd like to talk about are circular business models for emerging economies specifically. And so that's why you have a picture of an African city, because I believe that if we start to think about circularity in these contexts, that it needs to be thought about at the city scale, because cities are where the climate change battle will be lost and won, and it's also where most of the population will be. So just briefly in context, just to tell you the scale that we're really talking about. If we look at how urbanization has happened in the past, we can look at the first wave of industrialization that happened, and urbanization. It happened over about a period of 200 years, that people were moving to cities and industries were being created to support that growth in urban areas. And it was gradual, and the economy went in parallel with the population growth. Now, if we look at this most recent wave of urbanization, in about 80 years, we're looking at 3.9 billion people moving to cities, where before we were looking at about 400 million. So we have a lot of people coming, which means a lot of demand for buildings and building materials, and that all the other systems to build cities, the infrastructure, the transport networks, et cetera, all that really needs to be up to par when thinking about how to make this happen. Now, and of course, just to reiterate why this is particularly important for Africa is because the world as we know it with large cities is really distributed all over the world. We know Latin America, we think of places in Asia that have large cities. By 2050, that will really be mostly in Asia that we see our largest cities. But by the next century, all of these largest cities will be on the African continent, and where Mexico City and Tokyo, we're looking at metropolitan areas of about 30 million people in about 50 years. We're talking about cities that are 88, nearly 100 million people living in these cities. So we really need to think about how to build them properly and how can the circular economy come in and nourish this process. Right now, where I live in Rwanda, this is the extent of an industry in a lot of ways. There aren't, let's be clear, there are some factories, but really when you look at building materials, most of them are built, like this is bricks. Environmentally, you can see it's quite a disaster. And also it doesn't permit to really talk about the scale and the number of cities that we're looking at. So the idea is, how can we take this and create an industrial revolution that already has the DNA of circularity built into it for many, many different reasons. And the issue of not having industry means that our typical construction value chains that should be complete in order to allow us to achieve mass scale are actually really broken value chains. And those broken value chains, construction value chains, can only yield just a limited number of homes. The other missed opportunity, of course, is that urbanization usually goes in parallel with income. If we look at what happened in East Asia and Pacific, and in the Pacific, still in this most recent second wave of urbanization, we can see that as urbanization goes up, so has the GDP per person. In areas in Africa where I work, you can see that urbanization has gone up, but the GDP has stayed stagnant. In some cases, when there are political issues, like in Liberia, there was a civil war for a long period of time. Urbanization, people are going to cities for security reasons, but the GDP is actually getting worse because of the political situation. And just to underscore, if we look at China and Kenya over the same period of time, urbanization, the curve has gone up in both cases, but the GDP per capita has not. So it's really a missed opportunity for us, and particularly in Africa, where we think that by 2030, I mean, we only have 50% of the cities have not even yet been built. So it's an incredible opportunity to think about what is circularity at the beginning, and then what is circularity later in 2050 and 100 years, meaning that circularity might not just be recycling, because there, in some cases, is nothing to recycle. You actually have to create that circularity. That's especially important when you see building material prices, if there are disruption in supply chains. Here you can see I was tracking in Rwanda the cost of building materials, most of them that are imported. In the minute COVID hit, of course, you can see March 20 to April 2020, the prices skyrocketed and they never really came back down. So it really is imperative that we build these local networks. Also, it's important because the global share of buildings and constructions, right now, we know that it's responsible for nearly 40% of emissions, and mostly in residential construction. So again, not to beat a dead horse, but on many, many levels, this is extremely important. And there are so many youth coming to these cities, and they also need job opportunities. So why not have them be engaged in the building of these cities and in the creation of these circular processes? And the great thing, and there was this research that was recently published by Yale about the relationship between climate and building materials, is this should be good for everybody on the value chain. And this is where I'm saying the youth that's coming to cities, they should be able to plug in at many different levels, from the development to some of the contracting, the deconstruction, but also writing the policy that can make this circularity a reality. And so when you look at the value proposition, because I'm incredibly interested in value chains and making sure that this is economically interesting for the different partners, circularity actually can benefit the government, it can benefit the private sector, business, and then also benefits the citizens. And I think this is actually even, and pardon me for saying this, this is actually, in the context where I work, more important and the basis for all the other transformation that's going to happen and all the innovation around building materials. It has to be a win-win for all parties if this is going to be adopted and brought to big scale. And so currently, right now, if we think about circularity and you look at what's happening on the left, most people living in unplanned areas of cities, they naturally recycle. They buy reused materials, roofing materials, anything that's being, if there's a big project or there's demolition in the city somewhere going on, those materials are then resold. Unfortunately, this circularity is actually really expensive. They end up paying, 2-3 times more for these recycled materials because they're being There's a lot of speculation happening on it. So even though circularity is currently happening and happening at quite a large scale in these communities, it's not really what we're looking for, because in the end, it's not sustainable, because it still makes people very vulnerable to climate hazards, severe flooding, et cetera, and they still live in these precarious conditions. So as we look to as the cities look to transition to what we see on the right, there really, again, is an opportunity to think about how we can actually redefine circularity, and again, maybe even looking beyond just reuse. And one of the ways to do that at scale is if we start to even look at modern bricks, for example. In the area that I work, there is more clay than you can possibly imagine. And if you start to think that if you improve the clay production to make it more environmentally friendly, using biomass, so coffee husk, maize, rice husk, etc., that you can get from the wetland and do proper wetland rehabilitation, you can take those materials, you can build roads with it, you can build buildings, the furniture you can that you would need to put in these new buildings. The carpenter could actually, the sawdust could actually be the fuel for the kiln. But so there really is an opportunity to be quite circular and be circular at scale. And these are the types of technologies and industries that we need to be looking at, how we can modernize them, knowing that they can actually be cutting across many different systems, but also in the end, contributing directly to city building. We're talked a lot about waste and recycling. This is a picture of Nairobi, which has a terrible, terrible waste collection system in certain parts of the city. And so there have been businesses that have created, this is Mr. Green Africa. He's a great dynamic guy who has been looking at getting, collecting this waste, all this plastic, and then essentially turning it into different building materials to be able to sell it back to the construction industry. We can see that the same thing if we look at arena recycling industry in Tanzania, in US, Tanzania. In Tanzania, you can see that they're also doing waste recycling in Mycotile, which is also in East Africa and Kenya. They're looking at taking products from production waste like maize, the husk of maize, etc., to be able to build different construction materials that are entirely eco-based. So there are these initiatives that are essentially marrying businesses and economic viability with this idea of recycling or growing new materials to be able to be used for the building industry. But you can even tie that back to the city, I think, in a larger way. So if we look at South Africa, a map of Gauteng on the left, you will see all the different areas where people are engaging in backyard landlordism. And so that means I have a property, but my real business is in my backyard with what the structures that I'm renting out. Well, there's a business called Hustlenomics, and it's really about getting these youth, teaching them how to recycle materials to upgrade actually these backyard shacks or backyard homes. And so it's actually really addressing a major problem that the city has, which is all these backyard homes that are not necessarily to code, with poor access to infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But at the same time, also creating an economy of recycling that's at the scale of the urban scale and really has to do with city building, even though it's based in the logics of building material. I'm almost done. But so recycling is very, very poignant and important, but I also think that we need to look at upcycling in this context. One of the things that I was able to work on is starting to think about a business model where you could actually make bricks on site. So that long tunnel that you see is actually where we have teams building bricks or making bricks, extruding them, molding them, etc., on site, directly on a construction site. And the chimney that you see on the back is actually an underground kiln. And then later on so you can fire the bricks and then build the homes on this construction site. And then later on, essentially that kiln, that's an underground kiln, will actually be upcycled into be the septic tank for the construction site. And then that whole infrastructure is entirely removable, the kind of plastic Quonset hut looking thing, the machines using for bricks, and the whole team can actually go to another site. So again, it's business based, circularity to be able to address right now the lack of industry that's able to power this urban growth, to kind of think about it differently. And so this is what this looks like on the site, is this whole kind of portable cycle of production and construction that can later on be then connected to the houses to serve as the septic tank, and then everything else disappears from the site. The other thing that we did was really look at a whole host of building materials, start to look at different price points. You'll see the earning price points on the left, and then up to 2025, 2035, and 2050, create building material kits to let people know what assemblages they can make to be able to design and build a house, because there's a lot of self-build that meets their income level. And so what that looks like actually is that for another backyard landlord here who needs to upgrade the quality of her structures, that we can actually be able to support her knowing what building materials she can use now, but also knowing what substitution she can do. So as she gets more money, what building materials can replace what she currently has, so we can move towards greener choices, but actually also reuse between different economic brackets. So if people are getting rid of some of their materials, it can go down to maybe a lower income bracket, and then they can graduate up. But so all the people that are doing self-build can somehow be communicated and tied into a larger system that allows us, again, to not think about just recycling in terms of the material, but think about recycling in terms of entire neighborhoods and how that shift can happen, and then eventually in terms of entire cities that are not yet built. So thank you very much for your time, and that's it for me.
Wonderful. Oh my goodness. Thank you so much, Patu. I feel like I still learn things every time you present. So we're going to have a question and answer session. We're going to have all the speakers kind of present, and me as well. Again, we'll be moderating the questions through the Q&A. However, if you do want to raise your hand and ask a question, please feel free to. This is an open environment, and we would love to call on you. I know, Dior, specifically, you have a list of questions that I really want you to be able to ask our panelists, just because they're so rich and so beneficial. But I guess I could start off with one question that I wanted to pose, I guess, both to Samantha and to Jackie, but mainly to Jackie's point. Essentially, I'm thinking about the Rebuilding Center, and I'm thinking about how oftentimes whenever you have centers like Big Reuse or a Rebuilding Center, you have to, I mean, in my conception, you'd have to have like really high quality materials, or at least high enough quality to reuse without having to repair so much. And I'm curious, do you get a lot of contaminated materials? Do you get materials that are sort of difficult to reuse kind of as they are now? What do you do with that? And just thinking about what Samantha mentioned in the beginning about how maybe these materials go through maybe 1 or 2 cycles of reuse and then go back to the landfill. So how do you think about that? How do you think about contaminated materials?
Yeah, thanks. So this has actually been a shift here. So when I started in 2019, again, the ethos was really keep stuff out of the landfill. And so we took everything just about that came to us. And the result was chaos. The store was just like overflowing. It was hard to shop. There was just stuff everywhere. But the idea was really like, if we take these things, someone somewhere will find some use for them, and we've kept it out of the landfill. So when we made this philosophical shift to really focus on how we are benefiting our community and not just keeping stuff out of the landfill, we also drastically revised our acceptance guidelines. And so now we only take items that are in what we call dignity condition. So items that are able to be reused, like bits and bobs and stuff that people can repurpose in various different ways. But the focus really is on helping people who have not very much time, not very much money to pay to have something repaired. Maybe they don't have any space to do any repairing themselves. So to make sure that they can come and find what they need with us and just be able to put it in their homes, and to feel good about it, not to feel like it's some ramshackly thing that they're putting in their homes. So The effect of that has been that the quality of the materials in our store is much higher. It also means that we don't have quite as much material. It's put a bit of pressure on us to make sure that we keep enough material flowing through the store. And so we've had to really increase our procurement efforts, working with various members of the sort of renovation community to try and get more high quality materials and also new materials, because the fact is that if you have folks who are trying to come into code compliance, they need newer materials. They can't use, old windows or whatever. They don't have the high enough R rating or doors even. So we're working also with new materials manufacturers to get some new materials that are really helpful for folks who are trying to retain and maintain their homes. Also, a big shift for us has been, we used to think about our diversion rate, so to speak, as the amount of stuff that we took in. And now we think of it as the amount of stuff that we're putting back out into community. So we really can say that, like, if we are keeping 2 million pounds of stuff out of the landfill every year, that's 2 million pounds of stuff that is leaving our facility, not coming in. And that was a big shift for the organization also. So I hope that was helpful. Thanks.
Another question I have that I want to direct to Anne is just a very simple question, possibly. The material that you're making, be it the fiber, be it the durable plastic, the bioplastics, are these materials that can be recycled? I mean, when you were talking about how the loops and sort of kind of implies that there is kind of return to landfill, just curious, like, are you able to recycle these materials?
Yeah, I mean, technically, yes. So PHA is recyclable both mechanically and chemically. It's a thermoplastic. The thing is right now, with the way the infrastructure is set up, it's a number 7. And so therefore it would be automatically rejected just because there's not enough of it. And we don't really know have the infrastructure for recycling. There's a lot of groups, including some major brands, that are looking at the recycling of biopolymers, including PHA. So I think that could shift and that could change in the future, but it would be a dramatic infrastructure shift, and something that we're really focusing on, making the material and hoping that others can help us understand the different options for end of life, which is why we're really focused on smaller objects. I have some here, so like small caps and things that tend to fall through the recycling stream already. So it would be hard if this got loose to be recycled. And so that way it doesn't end up accumulating in the natural environment. So that's part of the strategy we have when it comes to going to market.
Got it. And then I want to kind of connect Fatu and Jackie here, because Jackie, in your presentation, you mentioned that there were an increase of 500% for lumber prices. And Fatu, in your presentation, you were talking about this sort of graph that mapped material costs over COVID. And I'm just curious, as we transition to greener materials, thinking about mass timber, thinking about all these terms that are very popular, they're going to put a certain demand, right? They're going to create a certain market. And being that we're trying to balance sort of circularity and costs always a consideration, how do you sort of figure how circular economy fits into these other movements that are happening alongside that sort of can cause these fluctuations in price? And then this is a question for you too, Anne, but how do you contend with that? How should we, I guess, maybe?
I'll jump in just quickly. The way that we think about reuse is that it creates a buffer against these price swings, right? It provides opportunity for people to continue to have the stuff that they need outside of the commodified environment. So if lumber prices skyrocket, we can still offer our lumber at low prices and therefore provide some insulation for people to be able to access materials outside of the, peaks and valleys of market rate prices.
I would say that it's also a policy issue and regulations. And it's also about tying, for example, what I didn't say about the waste collection in, let's say, Kenya, right, or Nairobi is so terrible that it's actually a service for the municipality. right? If you're able to step in and start collecting this waste and making building materials with that waste. So on a policy perspective, you could, in certain countries, in Rwanda, you certainly could put a cap on some building materials or incentivize building material recyclers to and you would take your budget that would usually go to the municipality who's collecting garbage and shift that budget to the private sector to start to provide some of those services that the public sector is not providing adequately. And then if you have the proper regulations to kind of frame that with some incentives, there is a way that you should be able to grow that industry until it's ready to be unleashed kind of to market forces. It's a very delicate process, but in some of these contexts where regulation actually works, you could start to experiment with and use other tools like that to kind of guide the material growth between two extremes.
Perfect. Thank you. Oh, Anne?
Oh, I was just gonna say that, yeah, I completely agree that like there's the policy shift. Plastics are cheap. It's really hard as a small company to fight against something that is so cheap. But we're seeing a bit more appetite for some policy shifts to look at greener materials. So it was exciting, Fatu, to hear that. Because that's a cool concept. I know it's probably not easy, but I love the idea.
And being that we have a couple minutes left in this presentation, or rather in this panel, I wanted to open it up to the audience. And again, Dior, I know that you had a couple of questions if you want to start, but anybody can feel free to raise their hand. I can wait a little bit. Otherwise, I can ask some more questions that are in the chat.
Put all my questions on. Okay.
Oh, okay. I'm going to ask some questions that you posed. Let's see. There was a question that was directed, a couple of questions that were directed to, let me start with Anne. What type of permits were needed for gaining access to that wastewater treatment?
Yeah, good question. So the current facility we're at is still demonstration. So we were able to obtain some, like temporary type permits. And then now we're in the permitting process for the full scale flagship plant. So everything from air permits, building permits, construction permits, all of that. We are in the middle of it. We are working very closely. We are the city of Vacaville has been welcoming us with open arms, which has been amazing. And even their city planning team has helped walk us through to make sure that we are not missing anything, or they have been amazing. We've definitely looked at other facilities where it was you're kind of on your own, figure it out. Whereas this one, they have been just nothing but wonderful. And so we're continuing to work with them directly to make sure that we follow all of theirs. And then also, as you can imagine, some of the federal and other rules and regulations that we have to follow. My colleague is spearheading that, so I don't know all of them off the top of my head, so I'm talking very vague, but we're definitely looking at that as an option, as something that's very important to us.
Wonderful, wonderful. And I do have a question for Samantha by Lauren. So are you aware of any successful public awareness campaign that has been effective in changing the public attitude in reuse? What seems to be, what seems to the most effective messaging that compels people to change? What seems to be the most effective messaging that compels people to change the way they approach their waste? In your opinion, in your experience, and anyone can answer this question, but I want to start with Samantha.
I have kind of an unorthodox view about public education campaigns to motivate people to approach their waste differently, in the sense that in order for them to do so, they need infrastructures to be able to do it. And those infrastructures start in the building that they live in. Is there a recycling bin? Is there storage space for a recycling bin? Is there curbside collection? Is the composting program that is being offered to them offered consistently, or is it implemented and then canceled and then implemented again, like has happened in New York City? Is there follow-up education about how to participate in recycling or composting? Beyond that, again, it's more, in my view, an infrastructural question. Are there drop points? Are there venues for people to donate unwanted goods in places that they know where they can go and buy them? Very little of what needs to take place, from my perspective, involves personal change on the part of the consumer. And I realize that this is not a popular view. But for many reasons, starting with the fact that it is really producers, as I've described, who are driving this whole system at massive, massive, massive global scales. They are making decisions about where mines are. They are making decisions to make more traditional plastic because renewable energy is coming online, for example. And individual actions can sort of respond in a certain way, certainly through politics, absolutely. And also, if you have inconsistent infrastructures that are going to be able to reach a certain scale for people to use. But in terms of personal choices and how people think about waste, to me, that is absolutely the least of our concerns.
Any responses to that? Another question for Jackie was just about sort of the history of the Rebuilding Center. You know, what is the story of how you got access to the space, given that, you know, by you know, what is the story of how the Rebuilding Center came to be, essentially? And also, is it community owned or controlled? And then lastly, how are you, like, what is the recruitment process for these instructors, and how are you retaining talent and knowledge?
Oh, great questions. So Rebuilding Center was founded in 1997. It was really founded as an attempt to, it was founded as part of a larger organization that was called Our United Villages at the time. And the idea for that organization was to try and create more connections within community. And one facet of that work was the Rebuilding Center. And there were other facets. All the other ones have sort of fallen away. And so now it's really Rebuilding Center is the main thriving component left of that larger organization. And so the intent of the organization has always been to build community strength and resilience. There used to be lots of different ways that it did that, and now it's really focused on reuse through our store and repair through our classes. The organization has grown over time, but when we started, we purchased a couple of buildings in a highly disinvested, historically Black neighborhood. And then that was in 1996. Portland has had extremely rapid gentrification, and so now the neighborhood that we live in, that we are in, is very, very different than the neighborhood it was when we bought this space. So we could never afford to have as much space in Portland proper if we were trying to do this operation now. Reuse is an extremely space-intensive work. The work is extremely space intensive, especially if you're talking about things like bulky items like furniture or building materials. And so that is one of the main challenges, is that it's hard to do it in dense urban areas, but you need dense urban areas in order to make it work, in order to get enough stuff and have enough of an audience to purchase it. So it's kind of a difficult situation, but we have been able to make it work because we've been here since before the city's gentrification explosion happened. We are not community owned. We are an independent nonprofit with a board of directors. So more of a typical nonprofit structure. And then in terms of how we retain our staff, we place a high priority on offering thriving wages and excellent benefits. And so it works out pretty well. We also have a pretty awesome culture. It's a fun place to be. We take joy in our work, and we try to make sure that the people who work with us have joy in their experience with us. So it's also kind of a funky institution and a bit of a Portland institution. So it's a known quantity. I think that's one of the reasons that we're able to keep going also, is because we have excellent brand awareness, having been around for so long. I don't know that a place like ours would be quite so successful in another market where there isn't such an emphasis on sustainability. Portland is a bit unique in that aspect. But all the confluence of all this luck has led to our longevity over time.
Yeah, I was gonna ask a question for you to extrapolate actually, but I'm happy that you gave that answer, simply because I'm just thinking about cities like Detroit, where in the past 20, 30 years, like the kind of shift of population is so stark and so dramatic and so anti-Black. And just wondering what it would look like to have sort of a rebuilding center model in cities like Detroit or in other cities like New Orleans that are also, after the Katrina hurricane, you saw this kind of major shift as well. But you can't really, the reason why I wanted you all here is because you can't take these models and just place them everywhere, right? There's very, very unique and specific conditions that create these different models, and especially thinking about circular futures and circular cities, as Fatu was bringing up, you really have to be context specific when you're thinking about the materials you'd find in Kenya versus South Africa versus America, right? And so I guess I want to leave room for anybody to raise their hand, but I do have kind of a sort of final question that I want to pose to Anne, but again, it's a broader question. But I loved what you said, love and hate what you said about methane being everywhere. It's kind of, as someone who just kind of jumped out at me. And I also want to connect to what Samantha said about how we're really trying to focus on scale, right? And like the scale of industry and the scale of cities, as opposed to the scale of an individual, because you can think about recycling. It's all that recycling campaign of the 80s was forcing producer responsibility onto consumers, right? But being a little bit of someone who likes to imagine beautiful futures, I'm curious, like this technology that you're creating that can be used in wastewater treatment centers or whatever, can it be scaled down to for communities to take control of the pollution they're experiencing in their neighborhoods, in Asthma Alley, in Cancer Alley, you know what I mean, all across the US and beyond? How can we begin to create this like citizen science technology or partnerships to create technology that can be used to deal with our pollution, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a really good question, and something that my co-founders and I have been talking about probably since day one. I think at this juncture of the technology and of our business, it really makes sense to go big, because then you can drop the price and get to economies of scale that can compete with the incumbent materials. But my, big dream is smaller units that are regional or household. I was talking even back, we did a bunch of accelerator programs early on, and somebody's like, okay, could you design one for a house? And then you're like making your own materials, and then you're 3D printing your plates and your whatever you need, and it's all so circular. And I'm just like, that would be a big amazing dream. Haven't quite figured out how to make that work economically at this point in time, but I think that there could be a really amazing opportunity once the material is more in the market and things like that, to shrink down that technology and offer it in a very unique way. We're doing a little bit of that when it comes to our work with NASA, because you only have so much room on a space vessel, and so while that's kind of even a little bit crazier to think about, it could be a model that we could then apply, back here on Earth with gravity, which will help things dramatically. And so yeah, I think it would be really cool. I just don't quite have the answer for that yet, but let's talk in the next decade, and we'll see if we can come up with something.
Well, thank you all for, again, just a very wide ranging. I apologize to anybody who likes to stay on one topic. We just jumped from place to place, but that's how my brain works, and I definitely enjoyed the conversations that were brought up from it. I don't want these conversations to end. So if anyone, and I know we're at time, but if anyone is, my goodness, sorry. 1 second. If anyone is in New York, I would like to invite people to come to a kind of post-panel happy hour that I'm throwing at 6:30 tonight at this bar in LES called High Note. Again, if you're in New York and you would like to come by, please join me. I would love to kind of talk more about this and figure out other ideas for circular futures. Otherwise, have a great evening, or rather have a great afternoon. And thank you all for joining. And here are some links that you can kind of take with you at the end of this. We have the link to the maintainers, as well as Jackie and Anne's companies and nonprofits as well. But again, thank you. Feel free to reach out to me at any point. Yeah, the end. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. I'll take care
Thank
of
you.
resources and the video of the event within this week, as well as some of the other event invitations that we have circulating around this space. Thanks again for inviting us to Dream, Jenna. Have a nice day, everyone. Bye-bye.
You.